Welcome, everybody. My name is Dan Weinberg, and I'm the board president of the Montana Innocence Project. I guess it was back in 2007, I took an interest in some newspaper articles in The Independent, written by Jesse McQuillan, and the articles dealt with the Berry Beach case. Berry Beach is somebody who's been in prison in Montana for, I think, 27 years now, and many people believe him to be an innocent man. Well, when due to that interest, I attended the parole hearings. There were some parole hearings held in Deer Lodge Prison, and there I saw some of the workings of the system, and a system that sometimes keeps the wrong person locked up. I also met Jesse McQuillan, the author of those articles, and it wasn't too much time later that Jesse and I talked, and I asked her if she might be interested in becoming the executive director of the Montana Innocence Project that I was thinking about starting. And she jumped at it. She was very enthusiastic, and she's continued to be very enthusiastic. And so with that, I just want to say welcome. Thank you very much for coming out on a winter's night, and your show of support is very important to us. I truly appreciate it. And here's our executive director, Jesse McQuillan.
Good evening and welcome, everybody. I'm Jesse McQuillan, Executive Director of the Montana Innocence Project, and thank you very much, Dan. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. This close to Christmas, I know a lot of you have traveled a ways to be here, and we just really appreciate your presence with us tonight. I also want to thank our major sponsor this evening, the Tippin Bewley Law Firm, and also Dwight Schulte, Attorney at Law. I'd also like to acknowledge the UM Schools of Law and the School of Journalism for their sponsorships of this event. Before I introduce our distinguished guest, Peter Neufeld, I just want to tell you briefly about our work at the Montana Innocence Project. We're a statewide nonprofit organization dedicated to exonerating the innocent and preventing wrongful convictions. One of many innocence projects throughout the country. The Montana Project, as Dan told you, was founded in 2008, and we're affiliated with the UM School of Law and the School of Journalism. Our clinic, based at the UM Law School, teaches law students and journalism students to review, investigate, and litigate wrongful convictions. Using DNA and other types of evidence, we provide charitable, legal, and investigative assistance to Montana prisoners who have credible claims of actual innocence. In addition to our small staff and the clinic students who work on these cases, we rely on volunteers across the state to further our work. So far, we've reviewed more than 250 claims of innocence, and we're currently have over 15 cases under in-depth review. Just earlier this week, Missoula attorney and a Montana Innocence Project volunteer that we're very proud to have, Colin Stevens, filed a petition for post-conviction relief for Cody Marble, who was convicted of rape in 2002. And hopefully many of you have read the news coverage that followed the filing of the petition earlier this week. Our investigation of the Marble case yielded the alleged victim's recantation and other crucial evidence to support this petition. Besides our work to help innocent individuals, we know that it's crucial to prevent wrongful convictions from happening in the first place. And so we work in the policy arena to improve our justice system and to educate the public. In 2009, we helped the Montana legislature to pass a law mandating that felony-level police interrogations be recorded across the state. This session, we're working to improve the preservation of DNA evidence so that this crucial evidence is available for testing to help settle innocence claims. Our work at the Montana Innocence Project, though, follows in the footsteps of astounding work pioneered across our nation by the guest who's here with us tonight, Peter Neufeld. Peter co-founded and co-directs the Innocence Project, an independent nonprofit organization that's affiliated with the Cardozo School of Law at Yeshiva University in New York City. The project currently represents hundreds of inmates seeking post-conviction release through DNA testing. In its 18 years of existence, the Innocence Project has been responsible in whole or in part for exonerating more than half of the 261 men and women to be cleared through post-conviction DNA testing. The Innocence Project has transformed from a clinical program with a single focus of exonerating the wrongly convicted into a leadership role in the burgeoning civil rights movement to identify and to address the systemic causes of wrongful convictions. The project has also been instrumental in reforming police practices in eyewitness identification, interrogation, and forensic science. The Innocence Project has also spawned the National Innocence Network, of which the Montana Project is a member, which is an alliance of more than 36 projects in law schools, journalism schools, and defender offices across the country and in 6 other countries. Peter is a founding member of the Montana Innocence Project Board of Directors. Years before, former Senator Dan Weinberg had the vision to help convene and launch the Montana Innocence Project. Peter was working here and helped with the DNA exonerations of 3 Montanans, including Jimmy Ray Bromgard, who were wrongly convicted based on faulty science and testimony from the former director of Montana's crime lab. We're honored to have Peter's guidance at the Montana Innocence Project, and we're thrilled to have him here tonight to speak with us about the age of innocence. Please help me to welcome Peter Neufeld.
I can't believe you thank people for coming out here on a cold winter night and this and that. I mean, this is the most beautiful place. I'm a guy from Brooklyn, and I would give anything to come here under any conditions. So you're lucky to be here. No one's going to thank you. Auburn, New York is a small farming community in northern New York State, pretty rural, a lot of dairy farms. And on the evening of May 23rd, 1991, fire alarms went off, and they could see up on a hillside smoke billowing out of a farmhouse. Firemen got there, and pretty soon thereafter the police got there. The house was aflame, and about 300 yards from the house they found a young woman who had been living in the house, renting the house from the family that owned it. She was naked. Her nightshirt was lying about 10 feet away. She had been beaten, she had been strangled, she had been bitten repeatedly, and she was dead. This is the kind of case that we think of as a real heater case. The community was outraged. Who would have committed such a dastardly crime as this? It's a very quiet, rural community, Auburn. They didn't have any suspects at first, so they thought maybe it had something to do with work. She was a manager at the local county social services agency. They went to the agency. They said, "Is there anybody here who had a beef with the agency and may have had a beef with this woman?" I mean, it's not exactly what comes to mind when you're thinking about someone who's raped, murdered, and bitten, but that's where the investigation started. And they remembered there was a guy named Roy Brown. Roy Brown, about a year earlier, got very angry with the agency because they had taken away his adolescent daughter from him, saying that he was an unfit father. And he became enraged by that fact, went to the office, threw some desks over, acted out, was arrested, and spent some time in the county jail. And he had just been released about a week before this brutal killing occurred. And so they went and questioned Roy Brown, and they knew they had these bite marks. So they asked Roy Brown to give a bite impression, which he agreed to do. And they went to a dentist, a forensic dentist, who had worked with the police before in that part of New York State. And the dentist said, it's a match. It's a match to Roy Brown. The bite marks, the 6 bite marks that were on the woman. Apparently she'd been bitten right through the nightgown into her skin, and there were 6 tears in the nightgown, lining up exactly where the 6 bites had occurred. Those marks were swabbed for biological material, but in those days there was nothing they could do with it other than prove that it was saliva and therefore that the perpetrator had bitten this woman. The police charged Roy Brown with the killing. The motive was some kind of revenge or retaliation against the County Social Services Agency. They interviewed Roy's estranged wife, who said that on occasion he would bite her as well. Then they got there was a jailhouse informant who had known Roy during the few months he was in the county jail, who had seen him since he got out, and said that Roy had confessed to him that he got drunk one night and met this woman, went back to her farm. She resisted his sexual advances, and then he killed her. So that was the evidence against Roy. Roy was convicted. He didn't have an alibi for that evening. He was convicted. Fortunately, New York had just recently then suspended the death penalty, or Roy would have gotten it. But instead, he got a life sentence. Roy was adamant about his innocence, and a few years after he was convicted, he took it upon himself to try and prove his innocence. So the first thing he did is he filed an FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, to get all the police records in the case, because he knew from the lawyer who represented him that there are only certain documents you get through discovery. You don't get everything. You certainly don't get as much in a criminal case as you get in a civil case. So he applied for the documents, and fortunately for Roy, the day the FOIA request arrived at the county sheriff's office was the first day on duty for the new sheriff. The last sheriff, the one who was involved in the investigation of Roy, had been convicted for embezzlement of county funds, and he was off in jail. But the new sheriff was there. He got the FOIA request, and he said, I guess I have to comply with it. And so he did, and he Xeroxed the entire file, investigative file. And once he investigated the file, he turned it over to Roy, who was up in Attica prison at the time, serving his life sentence. And Roy goes through the file, and he sees certain documents he had never seen before that had never been turned over to his defense attorney, involving other possible suspects, other possible leads. And there were a few of them, and one of them was a guy named Barry Bench, and Barry Bench was the brother of the guy who was the boyfriend of the deceased. And it had been the Bench family farm that the brother had allowed this woman to live in after they split up. And so Barry was just one of the people who was investigated. He was a volunteer fireman, and which, I have to tell you as an aside, in the town I grew up in, if there was a fire of suspicious origin, the first people you go to were volunteer firemen, because that's what they did if there weren't enough fires. But Barry was investigated. He was a bit drunk that night. He'd done a couple of suspicious things, but nothing that out of the ordinary. And as soon as they got the bite on Roy Brown and then the confession, that was, of course, the end of the investigation into any other possible suspects. But somehow Roy got a bee in his bonnet that this guy Bench must have done it. And so he decides that he's going to track down this guy Bench and write him a letter, which he does. And he writes a letter saying, someday they will develop through DNA testing the ability to examine those bite marks, and you will be identified. Repent now. Redeem yourself, or you will, spend the rest of your days in everlasting hell. He shows this letter to the counselor at Attica, who says, you can't send a letter like that. You don't know this guy. You don't have enough evidence. That's a terrible thing to do. But Roy ignored the advice. He sent the letter. And 5 days later, it was reported in the paper that Barry Bench threw himself in front of an Amtrak train and committed suicide. It was shortly after that Roy's family reached out to us at the Innocence Project and asked us to take the case. And obviously, our interest was piqued. We took the case. We found out that they didn't have the swabs anymore from the bites. They had all been destroyed, but they had retained the nightgown. The nightgown that had 6 different tears in it in about the same place. And our theory was, if someone was biting through, there would also be deposits of saliva on the outside of the nightgown, not just on the skin. And so for 2.5 years, the district attorney up there fought us, wouldn't consent to DNA testing. But eventually, we got it because the statute changed in New York to make it easier to get access to biological evidence. And we did DNA testing on the 6 stains. And we found that there was one male profile on all 6 saliva locations on that nightgown. And that profile excluded Roy Brown. We thought this was extremely powerful evidence, which was indicative of innocence. And we didn't know whose it belonged to, but we knew it wasn't Roy Brown. So we went into court and we argued before the same judge who had tried the case 16 years earlier. And he said to us, I don't really care much about this DNA evidence. I remember when that forensic dentist testified, and it was the most powerful evidence I'd ever seen. Your guy's guilty, leave me alone. So we left court, and we tried to figure out what our next step would be because we couldn't test it against this guy Bench. We didn't even know if he was really the perpetrator. We really believed our guy was innocent, but Bench was, you know, he was, what was little left of him was buried. You know, and obviously if you die that way, there's not a lot of remains. So we were in a quandary until we got a call from a young gal who was Barry Bench's daughter and said, you know, my father was an SOB and he could have done this. And he read about our story in the paper. Is there anything I can do to help? And we said, sure, give us a DNA sample. So she came back to New York, gave us a DNA sample, and then we did a paternity test, okay? And what we were able to demonstrate is that there was a 99.999% probability that the person who deposited that saliva in that nightgown was the father of this girl. So we went back into court with that, and at this point, we're now expanding our investigation into what is the other evidence that convicted him. The dental evidence, obviously. And we found out that what in fact had happened is that before the district attorney found this particular forensic dentist, he had gone and met with the state police forensic dentist, and he had shown him the bite marks on the deceased body, and he had shown him the impressions that they took from Roy Brown, and that forensic dentist had told the prosecutor they're not his. But the prosecutor had said, okay, fine, don't give me a report. I don't want to know about that. Never disclosed that exculpatory information to the defense, and instead got the second dentist to give the opinion. So we thought we were in great shape now. We went back into court. This time we brought the reporters because this judge was really, out there, thinking that he had more confidence in a forensic dentist than he had in DNA. The press, put a lot of pressure on the DA at that point, and he said what he was going to do was order an exhumation. And so he did order an exhumation, and from a little bit of jawbone, basically, that remained from Bench, they were able to do the DNA testing, and sure enough, it was Barry Bench's DNA on the bite marks all over that woman's nightgown. Roy Brown, of course, is exonerated, and he became one of the more recent exonerees of the 261 people who have now been cleared through post-conviction DNA testing. 17 of whom were on death row. And frankly, that number would be a lot higher because of the 261 cases, about 80 were convicted of murder. But they were convicted of murder in states that had either abolished the death penalty or, for one reason or another, maybe the jury had residual doubt, but they didn't seek, or they sought the death penalty, but it wasn't ordered by the jury or the judge. So we have these 261 cases. We started the project in 1992 with the expectation of maybe getting a few people out of prison where DNA evidence could make a difference. And then we realized as the numbers started mounting that we had an additional duty, that it wasn't enough just to get people out, that we had to start examining these cases, deconstructing them, try and figure out what the heck's going wrong with the system that's allowing all these innocent people to get convicted. I mean, it's very easy to figure out how they got out. They got out through DNA. That's no surprise. But how did they get in? And that became important for several reasons. Number one, just from a matter of public safety. In 90 of these cases, of the first 200 cases, in fact, we were able to help the police and prosecutors identify the real perpetrator using DNA evidence after we exonerated our clients. And in every single instance but one, the real perpetrator had committed other serious violent crimes during that intervening period. So once you realize that when you lock up the wrong guy, not only is that a terrible civil rights offense, if you will, but you're also letting the real bad guy stay out there at liberty to commit other violent crimes. And I'm talking about rapes and murders. Very serious stuff. So unlike a lot of other people who are trying to address criminal justice reform just by looking at the defendant, we were able to do something that was unprecedented in criminal justice reform, which was to say, as a matter of public safety, you've got to think about what's causing these wrongful convictions and try and fix it. So that was one important difference. The second important reason for us for getting involved in causes and remedies is that we learned very quickly, despite what you see on television, that most criminal investigations do not lend themselves to DNA testing. There isn't biological evidence in most cases. In fact, it's probably fewer than 10% of the cases. There's no semen left behind or blood left behind in a drive-by shooting or in the average robbery. There's nothing to test. So you have to deconstruct these cases to look at what's going on. Why are innocent people being wrongly convicted, and change it, make it more reliable, make it more scientific, and then you'll be able to actually eliminate or reduce the danger of wrongful convictions in the future, improve public safety by having the police focus on the real bad guys instead of the other ones. So we looked at this as an opportunity which we haven't really had in this country in the last 50 years. That's the background. And so what you do is, for those of you who think this way, it's really like seeing the world as a parallel universe, okay? The first universe is you look at a guy like Roy Brown and you say, he's guilty, right? He's a guilty guy. Look at all the evidence against him. There's forensic scientific evidence, a man in a lab coat. There's he confessed to somebody. You know, that's a pretty appealing case. But once you get that DNA exclusion, then for the first time you go, wait a second, we now know he's innocent. That means there was something wrong with that guy in the lab coat. It means there was something wrong with that confession. And that's what I mean by parallel universes. It's a wonderful kind of situation to study the causes of wrongful conviction. And so we started to deconstruct these cases, and we looked at the causes. And then we realized it wouldn't be enough to look at the causes unless you could come up with remedies. Remedies that Democrats and Republicans could agree on. That's before the most recent elections. Democrats that defense attorneys and prosecutors could agree on, judges, the public, that really sort of crossed all those lines because they were matters of common sense. That's what we're trying to appeal to. So take a look at the causes of wrongful conviction and the remedies, and they're pretty straightforward. The biggest cause of wrongful convictions that we found in our cases was misidentification. Of the 3 cases of innocent people wrongly convicted in Montana, 2 of them involved misidentifications. 75% of all the cases where we got exonerations involved misidentifications. And, there was a body of social science literature developing over the last 30 years which explains some of that. Part of it is the fact that when you do a lineup, you've all seen lineups in television and the movies or a photo spread, 6-pack. It's fine if the real perpetrator is in the lineup. But, the real perpetrator may not be in the lineup, okay, because they haven't figured out who it is yet. But they have a suspect. And that's how they do a lineup. There's one suspect and then 5 fillers. There's only one person that the police are thinking about as the potential perp. And what happens is, quite often, is that even unwittingly, the officer who's working the case can give certain nonverbal cues to the witness, to the victim. So they're more likely to pick the person out who the police think is the perpetrator. That's one problem. The second problem that the research pointed out is that people tend to make what are called relative judgments. And what I mean by that is if the perpetrator, the real perpetrator, is not in that lineup and the victim is looking at it, they're going to think to themselves, well, who among these 6 people looks most like the guy who did this to me? That's a relative judgment. And so they're going to pick someone who looks like that person, but may not be that person. And so those are 2 of the real concerns that you want to overcome if you want to make eyewitness identification more reliable. And the reason we were able to get reforms passed is that police realized that misidentifications were hurting their work as well. And the reason it was hurting their work is because they would bring in the victim or an eyewitness early in the investigation. They think they have the guy. They may unwittingly convey that cue, okay? the victim may pick out that suspect, and then a month later, through other leads or whatever, they get the real guy. But they can't use that victim any longer to prosecute the real guy because she's been burned as a witness because she's already picked the wrong guy. So it's not in their interest either to have someone picking the wrong guy. So in that sense, we had a kind of perfect storm to allow some of these reforms to be implemented. And what are the remedies? They're very straightforward. One is you want to do what's called a double-blind lineup. In a double-blind lineup, neither the victim, right? God forbid you don't want the victim to know which one of the 6 people is the suspect in advance. So that's blind. But more importantly, the person who administers the lineup doesn't know which one is the suspect. So you don't have the cop who's working the rape investigation or the murder investigation, right, run the ID proceeding. You have another cop who doesn't know anything about it. So that cop won't even, inadvertently convey that cue, right, to the witness. It's going to be a much straighter proceeding. And you also give certain instructions to that witness before they do the viewing. You say, look, the real perpetrator may or may not be in this group. Don't worry. If you can't identify anybody, that's fine. We'll continue the investigation, right? Reassure the person that way. Don't set up a psychological situation which is going to make it more likely that there'll be a mistake made. So those are the kind of reforms you want for ID. How do you get them? Well, the first way you get them is to try and get law enforcement to cooperate if you can. And like I said, it's in their self-interest. The problem we've had with law enforcement primarily on a lot of these reforms is not on the merits. It's just the teaching the old dog new tricks. Okay, it's hard for me to get lawyers to do new things. It's hard sometimes to get doctors to do new things. Well, it's the same way with police and prosecutors. This is the way they've always done it, and so they want to continue to do it that way. But we've made a lot of progress. A number of states have gone over to these best practices. A number of counties and cities have done it, and hopefully it'll happen here in Montana soon. The second most common cause of wrongful convictions is the misapplication of forensic science. And what I mean by misapplication could be using invalid science, using unreliable science, or using valid science, but the guy who's going into court exaggerates the probative value of the scientific evidence grossly beyond what it should be to distort the fact finder's interpretation of the evidence. For any of you who followed the stuff we did here in Montana, with Arnold Melnikoff, who was the director of your crime laboratory, who was also in charge of hair microscopy. The first 3 DNA exonerations in the state all involved Melnikoff, where he gave testimony about hairs found on the rape victim matching hairs taken from the defendant. And not only did he say that they matched, but he took numbers and pulled them out of thin air, saying that the likelihood that a head hair came from anyone other than this defendant is 1 in 100. The likelihood that the pubic hair came from anyone other than the defendant is 1 in 100. And therefore, the odds are 1 in 100 times 1 in 100, or 1 in 10,000, that the hairs at this crime scene could have been left by anybody but this defendant. Now, listen, if you just don't have any background in statistics or probabilities of math, that sounds great. And in fact, it sounded great to those jurors. It sounded so great to those jurors that after we got the DNA exoneration on the rape of an 8-year-old girl, where we tested the semen recovered from her underpants, which excluded Jimmy Bromgard, they interviewed 2 jurors in Billings. And one of them said, I don't care about the DNA. That hair microscopist was a very powerful, compelling witness, and I'm sure he was right. So, we can laugh now, we can smirk, but this kind of evidence is very powerful. It has a kind of mythic infallibility, and that's because we lawyers or we lay people who sit on juries don't know science. And so anybody can say anything and get away with it. This guy didn't have any databases. He just pulled those numbers out. And he did it in all 3 cases. In all 3 cases, it was 1 in 10,000. So you had that problem. But it's not just hair microscopy here. For some of you, I don't know if you've ever heard of the case of Brendan Mayfield, who was arrested as a family court lawyer in Portland, Oregon, who was brought in accused of being responsible for the terrorist bombings of the Madrid train station where hundreds of people died. They found a fingerprint on a bag of explosive devices outside the train station. The Spanish police took digital images of it, put it up on the Interpol. The FBI ran it against their database. They pulled out 10 people who had very close likenesses. They examined those 10 people, and they came out with Brendan Mayfield being a perfect match. Now, they also looked at Brendan Mayfield's background and the other 9 people, and he was the only one who had converted from Christianity to Islam. He was the only one who was married to an Egyptian woman, and therefore he became, the prime contender. And what you realize in that situation very quickly is the role that something called contextual bias, or examiner bias can play in all of our decisions. I mean, we do it all the time in little things on a day-to-day basis, where because we want something to turn out a certain way, we're going to see it in a certain way. Well, forensic scientists or forensic technicians are no different. They think they want to solve the crime, they want to help, and so they're going to nudge it along a little bit in that direction. That's what contextual bias does. It's not something that, it's not like, you talk to people in the forensic science community and say, we have this problem of bias, and they say, that's not true. I don't discriminate against black people. They don't understand that bias in a scientific sense has nothing to do with the way we use bias, on a daily basis. But you have to get through to these folks to make them understand what you're really talking about. So you have these problems of contextual bias. You have the bigger problem that, with the sole exception of DNA, and this is something that was reported by the National Academy of Science last year, with the sole exception of DNA, no other forensic discipline, really does have the ability to identify somebody, to the exclusion of everybody else. And why is it that for so long we were allowing them to do this? Because we didn't know. And how is it that these disciplines were able to take over in the courts and be utilized for 70 years and get tens of thousands of convictions when there really was no scientific basis for them? The reason is simple. DNA started not in the criminal justice system, it started in research laboratories. It then moved into medicine to identify certain diseases and do diagnostic work, long before it ever hit the criminal justice system. Consequently, there was a body of basic research, applied research, tens of thousands of peer-reviewed articles, FDA approval of the kits to use for disease diagnostics, long before it ever got to criminal justice. But these other disciplines never went through the scientific method. There's no medical application for fingerprints, for bite marks, for hair and fiber analysis. And they were developed by law enforcement for law enforcement, not by people who were well steeped in the scientific method. So there wasn't basic research. There wasn't an NIH getting involved in funding. There was no FDA to review an assay before it was used to decide who lives or who gets electrocuted. None of that. Instead, it was judges who could arbitrarily decide, hey, sounds good to me, I'm going to let it in, and besides, if the jury doesn't like it, that's their business. But, judges are supposed to be gatekeepers and only allow reliable science to be shown to jurors, because jurors are easily influenced by that guy in the white lab coat. But it never happened. And now, as we see all these DNA exonerations that were predicated on other kinds of forensic disciplines that aren't as reliable, that aren't fundamentally scientific, for the first time we're waking up and we're trying to do something about it. And what we're trying to do about it is to, for the first time, to get a national agency in place that will create national standards, that will fund basic and applied research, much the same way we had a revolution in clinical medicine 100 years ago. We want to try and replicate that for forensic medicine and forensic science now. And I've been spending the last year down in D.C. Meeting with people in Congress. There's a bill that's going to be introduced at the beginning of the next session in January. Whether it will work, I do not know, but in the alternative, we're also working with the White House, and I am optimistic that one way or another, we will get science to take over forensic science from the FBI, from the Justice Department for the first time in the history of this country in the next 12 months. And that'll be a major change that will have a trickle-down effect here in Montana and every place else. The second thing we're trying to do, which is part of that report, is to conduct audits. When we have a problem, I'm on the board of a medical school and a hospital back in New York. When we have an unexpected bad result in the OR, not only do we do a root cause analysis to find out what went wrong, but we also go back and look at other surgical procedures conducted by that same physician to see whether this was a one-off situation or whether it was indicative of a systemic problem. And we do that in all kinds of things. You do that if an engine fails. You do that when there's a train wreck. We do that when you catch somebody embezzling money who's a bank teller. You don't just go, oh, he embezzled money. No, you might conduct an audit to see if he did it with other transactions. So the notion of a retrospective audit is something we're all familiar with in our important institutions. But for instance, here in Montana, when we caught, Melnikov fabricating evidence in three serious cases in a row like that, and they were all exonerated by DNA, we pressed the then Attorney General Mike McGrath to conduct an audit here, and he refused. And he got away with it. He wasn't forced by the people of Montana to do it, so he didn't do it. And it's unconscionable, okay? You would, if it was your doctor who had treated your kid and screwed up like that, you would demand that doctor be investigated to see if it was happening with other kids. So why not do it when life and death is at stake or a person's liberty is at stake? But it wasn't done here. One of the things that will be required under this new order, if it comes out of Washington, will be those kinds of retrospective audits. Third problem, false confessions. I was a criminal defense lawyer, and I couldn't believe that anybody would ever confess to a crime he didn't commit unless he had a gun to his head or he was beaten. It didn't make any sense to me. If I had a client who they attributed a confession to, I was looking for a plea. That's what we did. And I was wrong. 25% of our wrongful convictions cleared by DNA involve false confessions. A guy named Earl Washington came within 6 days of execution in Virginia, confessed to a high-profile, cross-racial rape murder of a young white housewife. And not only did he confess, but he actually, in that confession, said, and I left my shirt in the top dresser drawer in the victim's bedroom because it had blood on it. I didn't want to walk outside. And they recovered a shirt from there. And so that became very powerful evidence that confession was reliable. Okay, the problem was that statement about the shirt wasn't coming from Earl Washington originally. It was something that was given to him during the interrogation by the police. See, one of the things that people don't realize, people know that one could falsely confess. For the few of you who had parents who were alive at the time, when Charles Lindbergh's kid was kidnapped, more than 250 people around the country confessed. There was a Senator Percy in Illinois, whose daughter was kidnapped, and 35 people in Chicago were, pulled into the precincts and interrogated, and they confessed. So people can falsely confess, particularly if they're vulnerable for one reason or another. Juveniles are more vulnerable. People who have mental retardation are more vulnerable. People who have other kinds of mental illness are more vulnerable. And some people are just more vulnerable, as we've seen with some of our clients. The problem is, though, that what police have been taught to do is to demonstrate that a confession is reliable, as opposed to the unreliable Lindbergh situation, is to see if the individual knows certain non-public details about the crime. Police are trained when they go to the crime scene and prepare it not to share everything with the press. So, for instance, if the victim is lying there with silver dollars covering both of her eyes, you wouldn't give that to the press. And the reason you don't give it to the press is when you get a suspect in and the suspect says, I did it, you say, well, did you do anything unusual? And he goes, yeah, I put 2 silver dollars over her eyes, boom, you know you got the right guy. And so it's called holding back key facts about the case. It's been going on for 60 years. It's a good thing to do. The important thing now is that when you then interrogate the suspect, after he says, I did it, you cease all leading questions and don't include any of those non-public facts in your questions, because they can then be adopted by the person. They're taught that as well, but they don't necessarily do it for the same reason that the police officer doing the lineup may inadvertently convey a preference for one person over another. They really believe they have the right guy, and so they're going to help him along. Okay? It's not some kind of malicious attempt to frame somebody. It's just sloppy work in that sense. And it's reckless. And so what's the fix? It's easy. Record the interrogation. Not just the denouement, not just the climax when the guy says, I did it, but the 8 hours before when he's being tuned up. Record the whole thing. And that way, when a judge looks at it, they'll know, did those non-public facts, well, did they originate with the accused or did they originate with the police during the questioning? So the court will be in a position to know what's reliable and what's not. Another problem, and a lot of folks don't like to discuss this, is the problem of police and prosecutorial misconduct. Almost 50% of our cases involve one or the other. There's a case now in the U.S. Supreme Court called Thompson versus Connick. And Mr. Thompson was accused of a capital offense down in New Orleans. And when the crime occurred, there were two crimes, actually, but when the first crime occurred, the perpetrator got into a struggle with the victim, and the perpetrator bled, and his blood was covering the pants leg of the victim. And the police knew this. And so but they never told it to the defense. And so the police did biological testing. It's before DNA. They did ABO blood group testing. And they found out that the blood came from somebody who was type B. Problem is that Mr. Thompson was type A. But they never told him that, okay? If they had told him that, the charges would have either been dismissed or he would have been acquitted instantly by a jury. They didn't tell him. Instead, he got convicted and sentenced to death. Some great lawyers who volunteered their time from Philadelphia fought for about 18 years to free him. And then finally, they got this report for the first time, long after in post-conviction, long after he'd exhausted his appeals, showing this. Now, he gets off as a result of that, and they want to sue the district attorney. But, they can't really sue the district attorney who did this because in our country, district attorneys have absolute immunity from suit. And even if they did something which turns out to be intentional and malicious, as this did, because after the information came out, it came out also that the DA who did it was dying of cancer, and on his deathbed, he brought in another district attorney, and he said, I did a terrible thing years ago. I got this blood report from the laboratory, which would have excluded the guy, and I deliberately didn't turn it over. So you have intentional misconduct, but the doctrine of immunity trumps it all. And if there's absolute immunity, which may have a good reason to exist, I'm not commenting on that right now, maybe. But if you're going to give people absolute immunity, then the alternative is you have to have some measure of accountability. There has to be accountability for people who break the rules, even if they're not committing crimes, okay? And there isn't any for prosecutors in this country. There is no effective disciplinary program anywhere in America. There is no, we did a study on all the cases that have been reversed for prosecutorial misconduct in California. There were several hundred that came up over a 10-year period, and only one person was disciplined out of several hundred prosecutors where there were explicit findings of prosecutorial misconduct. It doesn't happen. The same thing with defense attorneys who are bad lawyers and engage in bad lawyering. There's no accountability. In our society, if a lawyer steals $25 from a client, he can be disbarred. But a client who does no investigation in a capital case, as the case in Jimmy Ray Bromgard, a lawyer who gave no opening statement, didn't prepare for his closing, the assigned counsel in Billings did no investigations at all, filed no motions to try and suppress any of the evidence, including a little girl who was the eyewitness in that case, the victim, who said before trial she was only 60% sure of her identification. No effort at all. That lawyer would never be disciplined. You can kill somebody by your incompetence or malfeasance or just gross negligence, okay? And there'll be no disciplining of that lawyer. It makes no sense at all. So those are the kind of reforms that we need to fix these problems. There were more. As you saw in the Roy Brown case, we had an informant who was a jailhouse snitch. We've had jailhouse snitches in 15% of these cases. Guys who are going to get deals. In this case, this was a guy who got picked up for possession of a gun. And after he came forward with this information about Roy Brown, they dismissed the gun charge. The jury didn't even know about it. Sometimes the jury does know about it, but they still want to believe the guy. And why do they believe him? Because a horrible crime was committed and the community needs closure, right? But how can you trust those kind of jailhouse informants who are not even accomplices. They're just out there. In Canada, they're reviewing that problem, and they've decided now that there is no way to adequately regulate jailhouse informants other than to simply prohibit relying on them. And maybe we should think about doing something like that in this country. So those are some of the causes. Those are some of the remedies. But what you have to realize is that what we're trying to do here, as was mentioned in the introduction, is actually create a whole new civil rights movement in criminal justice. And the Montana Innocence Project is part of that. We're now a national movement, a network of in more than 35 states, of law students, of journalism students, of public defenders, of undergraduate students in some places like downstate Illinois, where the kids are going out and breaking open a few cases and solving them. It's really quite something. It's quite impressive. You think about it more for lawyers and law students, but it's great that there are journalism students doing it here. Montana is one of the few places where the journalism students are an essential part of that program. For those of you who have lived through the last 10 years and see not just the erosion of important newspapers in this country, but also the elimination of investigative journalism. In Chicago, the Chicago Tribune used to have some of the best investigative journalists in the country, and particularly in the wrongful conviction area. They were the ones who were making all the stories. One of the guy, Maurice Posley, actually was a visiting faculty member here. He said he came out for the trout fishing, but I think he really did care about the students and the cause. But at that newspaper, a guy named I think it's Zell is his name, who took over the paper, and he said, "What I need to do with this paper, because it's going to be a business that works, is I'm going to look at all the columns. I know I need equal number of columns of news and advertising columns. That's how we're going to run a paper. So which reporters have the most bylines? And those are the ones I want to keep." Well, he noticed that people who do investigative journalism pieces have fewer bylines because it takes them longer to get the article done. So we got rid of all the investigative journalists. It's a crime. It really undermines the core foundation of a democracy when you do that. But fortunately, there are some new groups that are springing up. There's a group that we've worked with called ProPublica out in California and in New York, and they're story-driven. And they're getting out there and they're rolling up their sleeves and they're looking for the good stories. They broke the story of the officers in New Orleans after Katrina, who took that man and killed him and then burned him in the car. There were 3 officers who were convicted of that this past week in federal court. They're doing a big investigative piece now on the misuse of coroners and medical examiners responsible for wrongful convictions all around the country. And when they do it they'll have it on NPR, on PBS, frontline pieces, and in print all at the same time. That's how they approach it. There's a group in D.C. called the, it's, maybe somebody else can help me, that's doing this as well, that used to be doing white papers, and now they're not going to do white papers, they're going to be story-driven. So there is this emerging movement there, which is terrific, and it fits in very nicely with what's going on in the law schools to try and reopen these old cases to prove that people are innocent. This burgeoning civil rights movement that was alluded to in the introduction has now gone outside the borders of the U.S. We now have 7 innocence projects abroad, and we have more on the way. The projects initially took hold in English-speaking countries like Britain, Ireland, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, but we now have a project in Norway. We have a project about to start in Mexico. Japan is starting a project. Japan needs it. In Japan, they solve 95% of their cases because everybody confesses, okay? Because that's what people do in Japan. It's part of the national way of life. We just exonerated 2 people in Japan with DNA tests, and so they're scratching their heads. We met with justices from the Chinese Supreme Court, and they came and they said to us that, we have a problem. Not all of our convictions can withhold scrutiny. We'd love it if you came and looked at some of the cases. And we said, no, we don't do that. These movements are indigenous, and it's only can be the Chinese that do this for themselves. And the judges said, well, we can't allow that. So hopefully something will happen there, And I think this is a movement that's taking off all over the world. I think people are thinking seriously about this notion of the rule of law, which is a good thing. And this whole innocence movement really complements the rule of law quite effectively. It means that the U.S. is not simply exporting armies or exporting jails, which is what we do with policing now a lot, but we'll be exporting rigorous scientific evidence. Evidence-based evidence, if you will, empirically based evidence to decide what is the truth, to decide whether someone is truly innocent or guilty. And if we do that, we'll not only have a system that's more scientific, a hell of a lot more scientific than it's been, a hell of a lot more about truth, but ultimately one that's more just. And that is the goal for all of us. When I think about why I continue to do this, it's been 20 years now that I've been doing it. I care about the policy. It's really important. I care about trying to change the way the system works to reduce the risk of false convictions in the future. That's all important. But I will tell you, for those of you who are thinking getting involved with any of the projects, the project here in Montana, at this point in my life, there is nothing better. There is no feeling that comes close to the feeling that I experience if I go into a prison after we've proven that somebody was wrongly convicted and they had been on death row or they've been serving a life sentence, and to take that person by the hand and walk out into daylight. We just had a case, a guy named Frank Sterling, who was wrongly convicted of a murder of an older woman along a railroad bed, and he'd been in for 20 some odd years and lost his whole youth, and so he never married and never had a profession, never did any of those things. Just punching license plates for 20 years in state prisons. And he was completely innocent. He had no criminal record. And he walked out that day, and we walked him out, and there's his mother, who had moved to Texas because of her health. There's his brother. There's his nephew and niece, who he hadn't seen. And he had bad health in prison, really bad health. And we were worried for a while we might lose him. But he got out there into the sunshine, and that nephew and niece, who we'd never seen before, came running up, and he gathered them both, both of them in his hands at the same time, and lifted them up and squeezed them. And that's why we do it. And hopefully all of you will have the opportunity to do that here in Montana. It's a great feeling. It's a wonderful thing to do. And I wish you all well. And if there's anything that we can do to help you in the future, we're available, okay, here in New York. So any questions, comments?
Let's hold off on questions for a minute, can we?
Sure.
Yeah.
What do you want to do instead?
I want to raise money.
Oh, go ahead.
Is that all right?
It's all right.
Yeah, thanks. Peter, that was great. That was great. Thank you. We are going to ask for questions in a minute, but we have some other business to do. And as you can imagine, running an Innocence project is not cheap. We need money to do it. To run DNA tests costs thousands of dollars. To copy documents, collect and copy documents costs lots of money. To send investigators around the state costs lots of money. And we need your help. So I would like to invite you to join us and see if you can help us out. We have a wish list. Is it out on the table? And we do gratefully accept volunteers helping us with investigations. We have several volunteers working with us already. We could use more. I would invite you to help us. Kaylin, do you have pledge cards handy, or where are they?
I think the best way to give is online.
Okay. 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 Please look us up online on our website, and on our website you'll see how you can pledge money for us, and we would very much appreciate your help. Jesse, did you want to come up and help with the questions, or just have Peter come up?
We have, let's see, the mics.
Let me just say one more thing too
Sure,
about
sure.
that. I mean, Dan's been here from the very beginning, caring about these issues, back from the Baumgart case, and approached us and really wanted to start things here in Montana, and has been incredibly proactive. But this is one of those things you can do where the bang for the buck is extraordinary, because at the same time that you are helping to exonerate somebody, you then provide the narrative. And we all know in our society, you can have all kinds of statistics and all kinds of data, and everybody will go to sleep. But when you see a person who, like a Jimmy Baumgart, who at 20 years of age, instead of going off to college, instead of getting married, instead of starting a career, went off to the prisons in Montana, and God forbid, when they had an overcrowding problem here, they sent him to a special private prison for sex offenders on the Arizona-Mexican border. And you realize the hell he went through, where he finally wrote to his mother and said, no one should visit me anymore because it will only provide false hope and false expectations, because I'm convinced I will rot in this prison, I will die in this prison, that is my future. That's a powerful narrative. And then when you have that and you go to the state legislature, you go to the police chief and said, we don't want more Jimmy Baumgarts, we have to do these things, you can do it. That's why we have 800 jurisdictions now that are recording interrogations in the United States. Why we have about 200 jurisdictions that have implemented these eyewitness reforms. Why we can have meetings at the White House about a federal initiative to set up this new national entity to regulate all crime labs in America and create standards for it, because of the power of the narratives. So when the project here in Montana is working on those cases, it's going to be a twofer. It's going to be helping to get these people out and also improving the quality of criminal justice in this beautiful state. So if there's anything you can do to help at this point, including getting your friends to help as well and your relatives to help as well, we will all appreciate it immensely. So any questions? Yes.
Yes. Is destruction of old evidence a huge problem in some of the older cases? Thank you very much.
Is destruction of evidence a problem in older cases?
Yes.
Yeah, we find that in more than half of our cases where we otherwise would accept somebody for representation, that we have to close out the case because in the intervening years, the key biological evidence has either been lost or destroyed. Some places are worse than others. People sometimes think, it's much worse in the South. Actually, the place where they lose more evidence than any other place in America is New York City. 60% of our cases have had to be closed out because the evidence couldn't be found. They didn't have documentation that it was destroyed, which would be one thing. They just can't find it. So, yes, that's a very serious problem. In the back. I'm sorry, I forgot.
Thanks.
What are we charging per question? A $1,000 gift for the Innocence Project? Is that what it was? Was it 500 or 1,000? I think we argued about that. Go ahead. They're going to get you coming out.
Oh, that's fine.
Sorry.
My father's gift to my older sister for finishing law school was an Innocence Project case that they're working on now in Ohio. And I was telling an acquaintance about that and kind of the background of the best that I could on the Innocence Project. And it was half kind of over her head and half that she just couldn't wrap her mind around, that you free people from prison. And I said, well, yeah, but they didn't do it. And she said, well, don't you think that they've probably done a bunch of other stuff before that they got away with? I mean, they're not good people. They were doing something to get involved with that in the first place. And putting the ignorance aside for a second of that, my dad was telling me about a case, and I forget the names, of a man who was wrongfully convicted and no one would take it, and his sister ended up going to law school to pick up the case and ended up getting him off. And he wasn't a good guy. He was kind of living on the margins, and he was an addict and was a career criminal, but he didn't do that crime. And I'm curious as to how much that plays into the cases that you guys take on at the appellate level. Once it's at your level, how much their personality and their, if they are a bad person but didn't do it, how much that plays into it.
First of all, Kenny Waters is the guy you're talking about up in Boston, was not a bad person. Kenny Waters was not a career criminal. He was a kid who was living on the margins, who got in some fights, who hung out with a bad crowd, who would steal hubcaps, committed some, petty thefts and things like that. But that's not a career criminal. I mean, at least from my perspective. Maybe I'm from New York City. I have the bar is at a different level. But fortunately, the sentiment that you heard expressed is not a majority sentiment. That people have the sophistication to appreciate the distinction that, frankly, if you're going to execute somebody or send them away for life, you better know that they did it. Most people here don't believe it's reasonable to lock somebody up or execute them because they did something else bad in their lives that they got away with. Half of our exonerees have no criminal record. Half have some record. Jimmy Bromgard, who was exonerated here, he was another kid who, he and his buddies smoked a lot of pot, broke into some cars and stole car radios, but he wasn't a rapist. He certainly wasn't a pedophile of an 8-year-old girl. And the reason he was brought in for the lineup is they did a composite sketch. And one of the cops says, "Hey, that looks like a guy I arrested in the high school parking lot who was having a fight with another student last week." Okay? It doesn't justify being locked up in those prisons for 20 years. So that's not a big issue. The only person I know who's a public figure who expressed that sentiment publicly was Supreme Court Justice Scalia, who at a public forum on CBS a number of years ago, when he was asked about that question, he said, well, the guy probably did something else anyway. But that's the only time I've heard that kind of cynical response out front. Doesn't mean it's not shared by certain people privately, but that's the only time I ever heard it. Yeah.
Do you think it would be just to go beyond just trying to free these people to pursue some sort of compensation for having spent that time in prison?
Question is should we also think about compensating those people? And the answer is sure. I mean, you can't, ever make somebody whole who lost 25 years of their life that way. But when we started the Innocence Project, there were only 4 states in the country that had compensation statutes. And now I think we're over 20. I don't know the exact number. And it's not a lot. It's something. It's some measure. I mean, there's a federal compensation law for federal prisoners that we got passed in 2004, which gives them $50,000 a year. That's, which I don't know what that comes out to a day. But, would you want to go to Deer Lodge for $200 a day and give up a month of your life or a year of your life or 20 years of your life? I don't think so. Sure, we should compensate them. It's funny, we tried to get a statute like that passed in Oklahoma, and it passed both houses. And then the governor vetoed it. And the reason he vetoed it is, he says, we can't possibly compensate them because that would be admitting that we've done something wrong. So, there's some of that. But on the other hand, we got a compensation bill passed in Florida and Tennessee, and we just got a compensation bill passed in Mississippi, where 2 people we represented were on death row because a forensic pathologist offered very questionable testimony in 2 capital cases, sending 2 innocent people, one to life in prison, the other to death row. We exonerated them through DNA and caught the real perpetrator, who was a serial rapist and pedophile. And they felt badly, and they created a compensation statute, and they've actually reformed their medical examiner law. So, that's what's so great about these cases. You want to get a few cases, because if you get these cases, the power of those narratives will really open up all kinds of policy doors that have remained closed for so long. Any other questions? Yes?
Requirement to record interrogations, is that established by state law or by what level?
It's done 3 different ways. I think there's now 12 states that require it statewide, although I said there are 800 jurisdictions that require it. In the states that require it statewide, it's done through legislation, or it's done by the highest court of the state deciding a case, and as part of that decision, ordering the recording of interrogations, or it's done a third way through court rule, where courts have certain administrative capabilities where they can create rules statewide. Indiana recently did it that way. And I like the court rule approach because they were able to actually decide what the exceptions are, what the effect of it will be. The sanction there is not that it's suppressed. The sanction is that there'll be an instruction and an adverse inference communicated to the jury on the failure to do the tape recording. Sometimes when you just do something like that, it's a nice carrot and stick to get law enforcement to do the right thing. So there are 3 different ways to do it. But most of the jurisdictions that have done it, it's just to us talking to police chiefs, district attorneys. You know, it's funny, in Minnesota, the police chief of Minneapolis said, you know, it's the best reform that was ever shoved down my throat. Okay? And it's so obvious that it's a good thing for law enforcement, because there are all those cases that you have where the defendant says, oh, I never said that, right? And then you get into a match about that. Well, all you have to do is press the play button. So it's such a great thing for law enforcement and public safety, but like the ID situation, it's old dogs and new tricks. People don't want to change the way they do it. So, you know, you have to overcome that. But in every single jurisdiction where they started recording interrogations, there's not a single department that wants to get rid of it now. They all love it.
Oh, we have a couple back here that were first.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Following up on your comments on compensation,
Yeah.
I think as a direct result of your work in Montana, the legislature in 2003 passed a measure that would allow exonerees to go to college, subject to appropriation by the legislature. There has been no money attached, I think, ever since that was passed. Have you encountered that in other states? And
No.
do you have any guidance for us in Montana who would like to see that
I've never
promise
encountered
kept?
that in any other state. In every other state where we got compensation, it was real compensation. I don't think that offering somebody like a Bromgard who spent 18 years in prison, or however many years it was, a chance to go to state college if he so desires is really adequate. And I don't even mean legally. I mean it's not adequate morally. Okay, and that's what we're really talking about here. What happened to him was just appalling. He, after he was exonerated and they passed that statute on tuition, he enrolled at Montana State in Billings, and he showed up to get his ID card, and with the article saying he'd been exonerated, and they said, sorry, it was an unfunded mandate, so we can't do it. Fortunately, the Billings Gazette ran it as a front-page story, embarrassing the regents or the trustees, and the trustees reached into their own pockets to pay his tuition that semester. But no, there should be a real meaningful compensation statute here in Montana and elsewhere. But you know, these things take time for a lot of reasons, I guess. In the back, are there more?
I had a question. I'm actually involved with the local cadet program, and I'm looking to become a police officer myself. And I was just wondering, in general, do you get more police stations that want to work with you or are resistant to your program? Because I personally find your program really interesting.
I think more young officers are more turned on to the program and want to do these things, want to do the right thing. It's mostly the older police officers who are more resistant. But having said that, you know, we still get 800 different jurisdictions to want to record interrogations. We still get, you know, a couple of hundred jurisdictions that want to do photo spreads the right way because they don't want to burn the witnesses. So they understand the importance of it as well. You know, it's hard for me to get my colleagues who are lawyers to do better at what they do because they've been doing it one way for 30 years. It's hard, and that's why we need, you know, new blood because you're more willing to do things differently. And you know, I would encourage you to do that. It's great that you're joining the force, and you should really push them as much as you can to be more scientific and to do these things. You know, one of the things that's happening here in Montana is they want to improve the eyewitness identification methods. And they did a study, a survey of various jurisdictions in the state to find out which police departments have policies, have manuals to instruct the officers on how to conduct an array or how to conduct a lineup. And only a handful in the whole state have written policies. You know, they want to work with, and you can explain this better than I can, so jump right in. They want to work with the statewide academy because the academy didn't have much training on how to conduct lineups in a race. And you can't just say, well, I've seen it on television, I know what to do. You know, if you say there's a science to it, well, I mean, God forbid, as we were saying before, could you imagine, going to a surgeon, he goes, I didn't need training, I saw it on TV. It's crazy. And those things that happen in the eyewitness room decide who's going to get locked up for 50 years and who's going to go free. So there should be training statewide at the academy, and hopefully that'll be embraced now. Yeah.
I was wondering, I have read a lot about the Cameron Todd Willingham case in Texas, and I was wondering where you ranked arson, fire expert testimony with DNA and your other.
Cameron Todd Willingham was convicted of arson murder, and he was accused and convicted of burning his own house down in a fire that killed his 2 little girls. And they, at the time, said, there was a theory that perhaps it was an electrical fire, or an accidental fire, but the fire investigator said that it had certain hallmarks of an accelerant. They didn't do any chemical work to show there was an accelerant, but there were burning patterns and this other kind of stuff, crackling, that suggested it was an accelerant. In 1992, there was a scientific review of all the literature and studies on fires. And they went out and they started setting fires in this controlled environment to see if they could cause the same kind of phenomena without an accelerant. And sure enough, they did. And it revolutionized the whole science of arson investigation in the 90s. But what it also did is it shined a bright light on the fact that many people for many years were being convicted of fires that probably were accidental, but they were being convicted of it being arson. And it turns out that the evidence that convicted Willingham was that kind of evidence. Evidence that is completely consistent with an accidentally caused fire, not with an accelerant fire at all. And it means that the evidence that was used to convict him and cause his execution was not good science, not valid science. So there are many other arson cases. In fact, there may be arson cases here in Montana. People who were convicted in the 80s, the 70s, and even into the 90s. Because it's only quite recently that the new standards are being adopted all over the country on interpreting burn patterns and that kind of, and residues and what have you. So we've tried to get other people involved because we're concerned with DNA, but we tried to get other groups involved with taking on these cases nationally. That hasn't been successful. But there are projects around the country that are looking at individual cases, and they've had some success, and they've gotten some exonerations in other arson cases.
I have a follow-up to that question. I'm familiar with that case because there was a lengthy article in the New Yorker about it maybe a year ago. And one of the details from that article that stuck out in my mind is that it sounds like prior to his execution, there was a suggestion there might be contradictory expert testimony. And I have a torts professor who has been adamant about understanding the role of expert testimony in jury decisions. And so I'm curious, or I'm wondering if you can speak to contradictory expert testimony and what the jury's role is in evaluating that and understanding it. And I was thinking as you were describing the case in your comments about what would have happened, for example, if another dentist had come up as an expert and said, "I disagree with that."
Well, that's a good, I left that fact out. In the Roy Brown case, the defense called a more senior forensic dentist who came in and said it's an exclusion. Said it's not Roy Brown's teeth on that girl. And what's so interesting about it, I didn't go into the details because of time, but in that case, in the young woman's back, there were 4 impressions. So the 2 front teeth, and then what are the other ones? These are your incisors? Incisors. So those are the 4 marks. Now, Roy Brown had his incisors removed when he was 14 years old. And so the forensic dentist who saw 4 impressions, where Roy only had 2 teeth, had to do some fancy footwork. And what he said is, the elasticity of skin is such that these things are happening very rapidly. They're not just stationary when you bite somebody. And so you can twist the skin while you're biting, drag the teeth, creating the extra 2 marks. The other person said that's preposterous. But again, he's convicted. Why is he convicted? Because it was a horrible crime. And what you have to appreciate is that to a lot of folks who want closure from this horrible event that happened in their community, reasonable doubt, which is the burden of proof, in our society, isn't enough to win a case. What you have to show that jury is, if it wasn't me, I've got to show them who it was that did it. For Jimmy Baumgart here, an 8-year-old girl lying asleep in her bed in her family's home in Billings, okay? Someone comes in through an upstairs bathroom window, goes into that bedroom in the middle of the night, and rapes that little girl. You can't argue to the jury you don't have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They don't care. Someone's got to pay for what happened to that girl. Someone had to pay for what happened to that woman, okay? In the Willingham case, 2 little kids lost their lives. So we as a country haven't dealt with that psychology yet. In the Willingham case, there wasn't that there was a counter expert at trial. It was that after trial, it was reviewed by one of the foremost arson experts who wrote a report saying, this is nonsense. We've reviewed this stuff. The whole community now has a different attitude toward this. This was nonsense. That report was sent to the governor and reviewed by the governor's pardon commission shortly before the governor of Texas ordered the final order for execution. And it was simply ignored at that point in time. As for the role of competing experts, for the reasons I just stated, it doesn't work. It never worked. Frankly, what we're trying to do is get to a more science-based order. And that's why when we talk about creating a upstream system where disciplines will be validated, where, like an FDA, parameters of reliability and uncertainty will be established beforehand, reports will be comprehensive, not the nonsense I saw coming out of Montana in those 3 cases where it's 3 lines long, basically the guy going, yep, thumbs up or thumbs down, okay? But a comprehensive report, the kind of report you would want if it was your brother or sister who was about to maybe undergo serious surgery for the removal of a limb. You would want to know that the scientific test really demonstrated the necessity of that. That's non-existent in the criminal justice system. If we get that, then lawyers and participants will be able to make a much more intelligent, enlightened decision as to what they should do. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could shed light on the distinction between not guilty and innocent.
Sure.
Because it seems as if as you backtrack through the evidence and maybe uncover new evidence in a case of a wrongly convicted person, you may find that that person is not guilty because there is no evidence to prove their guilt, but there isn't necessarily evidence to prove their innocence.
Sure, that's an important distinction. To say that someone is not guilty is a legal term, meaning that there isn't proof beyond a reasonable doubt to demonstrate their guilt. At the Innocence Project, we're looking where the evidence actually proves affirmatively their actual innocence. So when you have an 8-year-old girl who's raped, and semen is deposited by the rapist, and it's recovered from that little girl's underwear, and the DNA testing proves that the guy who was convicted didn't do it, that's innocence. That's not guilt. I'll tell you what's not guilt as opposed to innocence. There's a guy named Claude Jones. Claude Jones was executed in Texas in 2000 for commercial murder. The only evidence to convict him was an accomplice who said Claude was with me. But under Texas law, if you have accomplice testimony, it has to be corroborated by some other kind of evidence. The evidence they used to convict and execute Claude Jones was a hair was found on the counter of the liquor store where the killing occurred. The state chemist testified that that hair matched Claude Jones's. So that was the evidence to corroborate the accomplice implicating statement. Without that evidence, they couldn't have convicted Claude Jones. He's executed. 4 weeks ago, we do DNA testing on the hair. He's excluded to a scientific certainty. Okay? That doesn't mean that Claude Jones didn't commit the crime, but it does mean that the state lacked adequate legal evidence to convict him and to execute him. That's the difference. Okay? No, we look, our cases and our list, our 261 cases, are all people with DNA evidence proved innocence, not guilt. I just mentioned Jones, he's not on our list. I wanted to just explain the distinction. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thanks again to everybody for coming out. I just wanted to remind you, we have a website. It's mtinnocenceproject.org. You can learn some more and get in touch. And we also have sign-up sheets out in the lobby. We have a monthly e-newsletter if you want to keep learning about what we're up to at the Montana Project and get involved with our work. Thanks again, and have a good evening.